Hello and welcome to our online conference. Today it's Decolonising Psychotherapy. And I'm Juliet Newbigin. I'm a senior psychoanalytic therapy member of the BPF, and I've got a long-standing interest in the impact of the wider social context on the development of individual identity within the family. And I'm acting as chair for this event today. And with me is Jane Johnson, who is my co-chair and she's the Zoom expert, and she'll be managing the technical aspects of the conference. So Jane is a senior member of the British Psychotherapy Foundation, and she's a training analyst for the British Jungian Analytic Association. And there's going to be quite a lot of technical expertise required today, so it's in Jane's capable hands. So just before we move on, we have two speakers today, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. But just before we move on, perhaps I'll say a word about what we're doing here today and the meaning of this word decolonising. So when we say decolonising our psychotherapy profession, we're referring to a process of examining who we are and what we do in the light of the lack of diversity in our membership as a profession. So in coming together today, what we're hoping to do is to enhance an awareness in those of us who are white and share a European colonial heritage, of the impact of that colonial history on our attitudes to race and ethnicity, in ways of which we might otherwise be unaware. And we are unaware usually until we have input from those of us who come from a different cultural or ethnic background, who can see much more clearly than we do as white people what's going on. So you'll be hearing more about that in a minute from the speakers. Just to say that we haven't actually programmed time for questions after the speakers. We'll have a short break, and then we'll be going into breakout groups where you can discuss what you've heard. But the aim of the day is very much about, this is a working event. So what we're trying to do is collaborate in working towards proposals to change things. So I'm asking you to stay after you've heard the speakers. This isn't just a couple of lectures. We would really like you to engage with us in thinking about what we can do to move our profession on from this narrow mindset that arises from its lack of diversity. I'd like to introduce to you Helen Morgan, who's going to give the main paper. So Helen, I'm sure most of you know Helen. She's a fellow of the British Psychotherapy Foundation, and she's a training analyst and supervisor for the Jungian Analytic Association within the BPF. Her background is in therapeutic communities with adolescents and in adult mental health. She was chair of the British Association of Psychotherapists from 2004 to 2008, and of the British Psychoanalytic Council from 2015 to 2018. And she's written a number of papers on racism and psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And she's currently working on a book on the disavowal of whiteness, particularly relevant for our topic today, which is due to be published early next year. So the papers that she's going to present now is a version of a chapter from that book. Okay, Helen, over to you.
Helen, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Juliet. Just to say that the title of the book is a working title. I haven't quite decided. Text is going off in a few days. I hope to write it, so I've got to make some time. And to also say, this is very, very strange experience if you read the paper in my back room. My first experience of a formal discussion about race and racism within the world of psychotherapy. In the Institute, and as a trainee, I attended a presentation by Lennox Thomas in my training organisation. Lennox was one of the first Black people to train in psychoanalytic psychotherapy in Britain, and he became an important figure as a writer, teacher and activist. Originally trained as a social worker, he went on to become clinical director of NACIA. He was co-director of the UCL MSc in Intercultural Psychotherapy and co-founder of the Refugee Therapy Centre in London. Lennox died very recently, and it is to him I dedicate this presentation. The seminar I attended was around 35 years ago, but I still have memories of the evening. I came to London to train and was employed as a care worker in a therapeutic community for adults with mental health difficulties in northwest London. There I met and worked with Black colleagues and clients and was on a steep learning curve regarding racism, especially my own. Lennox's presentation, therefore, was very welcome. Throughout the talk, Lennox was controlled and gentle, taking care not to alienate his all-white, mostly female audience. He drew comparisons with gender, speaking of his obligation as a man to be aware of and think about how his behaviour might impact on women. He was asking us in turn to take responsibility for our racism. Throughout the evening, he applied a solid understanding of psychoanalytic principles to make his case. I was impressed and moved by the talk as he opened up connections between what I was learning in my training and my experience of work. And he presented a whole new landscape I was keen to explore. Eagerly, I waited for the discussion to see how others were affected and what my training organisation might consider doing in response. However, the conversation was deeply disappointing. No one directly challenged Lennox. No blatantly racist comment was made. Every speaker started with gratitude and an almost obsequious praise. Then each went on to make a comment that served to eradicate any possibility of potency from his talk. There was a series of personal statements from the audience, all of which asserted an exceptionalism that removes a speaker from the list of whites who might need to think about his words. Others asked why we were not discussing other injustices, class, gender, sexuality, etc., managing to drown the matter of racism in a list of social wrongs. Further questions were thinly disguised complaints that really it was all Black people's fault.
Helen, can I just say some people are finding it hard to hear. Could you adjust yourself so you're a bit closer to the mic, maybe? Okay, if you keep going, people can send me a message if it's still.
Is that better?
I can hear you okay. Yeah, you keep going.
Over years of writing and speaking on the subject, I have heard these ways we white people use to defend ourselves from thinking about our own racism many, many times. The list is depressingly limited, ubiquitous and repetitive. Since that evening, I have tried to address the issue of racism from a number of positions within the profession, starting as a young, angry trainee, to writing and teaching as a more senior member of the profession, to becoming chair of my own membership and training organisation, and then chair of my regulatory body, the British Psychoanalytic Council. Working with colleagues, we conducted research projects, set up working groups and conferences, raised matters at council, and called meetings of those responsible for training. There have been some changes. I used to experience outright hostility where students and course participants were openly angry that time had to be spent on this irrelevant subject when they had so many other things to learn. People now are generally more open to the chance to focus on the problem and think about the implications for themselves and their work. I do know individuals change. However, apart from some tinkering, our institutions do not. Black, Asian and minority ethnic people who have grown up in Britain will have suffered from racism in some form or another. It will have been and continue to be a dimension of their personal and social life, which needs acknowledgement and understanding. However, it is often reported by Black psychotherapy students that their predominantly white analysts, supervisors and trainers mostly fail to recognise the reality of the problem. The consequence is at best significant concerns and personal experiences are not thought about and understood within the ordinary analytic endeavour, or at worst, previous trauma is repeated and reinforced. In 2004, Margaret James Franklin interviewed a number of Black psychoanalytic psychotherapists who had trained in different psychotherapy organisations about their experiences for her MSc dissertation. Some years later, a group of us in the then BAP carried out a survey across the organisations, the findings of which were written up by Karen Ciclatera and Nina Foster and published in 2012. In 2013-2014, the Ethnicity, Culture and Racism Task Group of the BPC, chaired by Maxine Dennis, undertook to survey registrants on attitudes to how ethnicity is addressed in their member institution. These findings were presented to an extended meeting of the senior leadership of the training organisations which are registered with the BPC. What emerges from this research is how hard it is for the Black individual to get through a training in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. The pressures are subtle but wearing. Some felt that their ethnicity attracted negative special attention during the interview process, citing instances of being quizzed on matters not put to white applicants. Many spoke of raising questions and concerns in seminars about theoretical and clinical material from the point of view of diversity, racial difference, cultural variation, racism, etc., which were ignored or dismissed by teachers and peers who were clearly uncomfortable in speaking freely about these issues. Many were told explicitly or implicitly, because this was depth analytic work, the difference in race and colour was irrelevant. This leaves the Black trainee in an ambiguous position. If they raise the issue, they can be seen as being difficult in bringing such uncomfortable matters into the room, or failing to be sufficiently analytic by focusing on the so-called outer world concerns. But if they don't speak, they then collude with what amounts to a whitewash. Very few could recall times when the subject was raised by white seminar leaders, supervisors or colleagues. Taken as a whole, the research reveals a climate of colour blindness where trainers, supervisors and analysts take the position that difference in colour are not noticed and not relevant to in-depth analytic work. We are assumed to all be the same. This denial of the reality of the impact of racism and power differentials means the Black trainee is required to disregard important aspects of her or his experience and put aside their Blackness if they are to survive. Frank Lowe writes, "I haven't met a Black therapist or trainee therapist who has been satisfied with their training organisations' handling of race issues or feels confident that the profession is addressing the problem. I have explored how colour blindness or race avoidance can occur as a defence against fear and helplessness, and I believe it also operates at an institutional level as a mechanism to maintain power." He goes on to quote a number of Black colleagues about their experience of training. "Whenever I raise issues about race and culture, I am told this course is about the internal world, not social issues. During my interview, I was asked about working with white patients, but none of my fellow white trainees were asked about their ability to work with Black patients. I feel isolated with my experience of the training, and I do not feel confident that I will get support if I talk about my experience and views as a Black person. I think it's probably best to just keep my head down and get through the training." Eugene Ellis is the founder and director of the Black and Asian Therapy Network, Barton. In an interview in 2013, he points out, "What tends to happen with Black trainees is that they enter into the spirit of inquiry that is encouraged on any counselling or psychotherapy training course. But when they do so in the area of their culture and their race, there is all this silence, and it's like you've just opened a huge hole in the floor. Somehow it becomes your fault. You can then choose either to say nothing because it's too painful and focus on just getting your qualification, or you insist your voice is heard, get labelled as the troublemaker, and risks not making it to the end because you're worn out by the fighting. It's so sad to see this happen, and I've heard this from so many Black and Asian students. It all goes on under the surface. Just naming what's going on becomes almost impossible, and everyone gets defensive and blaming. It's normally the student of colour who gets the rougher end of things because that's how oppression works. What then happens is that students have to go outside their training to get what they need to develop as therapists within the profession. In a working note for a group interested in exploring matters of race and equity in the profession, Andrew Krupa wrote the following. We think that for Black and minority ethnic people, the experience of racism tends to be pervasive in one form or another. But this does not mean that this is the whole of what their lives consist of. It is a dimension of personal and social experience. But a difficulty arises when they try to give voice to this aspect of their experience, because white Anglo-Saxon people and institutions usually do not or cannot hear and simply take it seriously for what it is. One very important matter that needs understanding, recognition and thought. We think the consequence of such a failure of response is predictable and inevitable. A redoubled effort to make others take in the seriousness of the issue, which can in turn lead to a more strenuous effort to renounce the now even more unpalatable communication. The stage is set for systematic misunderstanding and a culture of defensive race relations. Black people have a chip on their shoulder and white people are racist. Shannon Sullivan considers the trajectory of the great classical philosopher of race, W.E.B. Du Bois, who began with a liberal approach to the elimination of racism. Du Bois' liberalism naively posited human beings as always wishing to do good, and as failing to do so only because they did not know what the good was. Calling for white people to become more familiar with the lives and situations of Black people, Du Bois put his faith in the basic goodness of white people. Their increased knowledge would reduce Black people's perceived foreignness and eliminate the reasons for white people's racist attitudes and behaviours towards them. After World War I, Du Bois went through a process of considerable disillusionment until he reached the point where he saw that to understand the white ignorance of non-white people, one has to hear the active verb to ignore at the root of the noun. What initially seemed to him like an innocent lack of knowledge on white people's part revealed itself to be a malicious production that masked the ugly terrible of white exploitative ownership of non-white people and cultures. In his autobiographical work, Dust of Dawn, Du Bois writes, "My own study of psychology under William James had predated the Freudian era, but it had prepared me for it. I now began to realise that in the fight against race prejudice, we were not facing simply the rational, conscious determination of white folk to oppress us. We were facing the age-long complexes sunk now largely to unconscious habit and irrational urge." Psychoanalytic explanations of how racism operates tend to draw on the dynamics of projection, introjection, and splitting. This helps to illuminate how the individual uses the system of racism, that exists in society, but it doesn't explain the system itself. Racism and the creation of the races is a social, political, and economic phenomenon. It is a structure of power relations within which we live, so the statement, "I am not a racist," is meaningless. Whilst it may be used by the individual psyche, that is not where the cause nor the solution is located. A psychoanalytic approach can offer ways of thinking about how the system is maintained, but we need to widen our thinking from the usual focus on the individual in isolation and see the connectivity between us. Fahad Dalal's concept of the social unconscious is helpful, as is that of the cultural complex and phantom narratives, developed by the African-American Jungian analyst Sam Kimball's. The extension of the idea of the racial complex has been taken up by Fanny Brewster in the US and Frank Lowe here. There is now plenty of research to show that children are aware of racism at a very early stage, as young as 3 or 4. It seems that the mechanism is a top-down matter, where, curious about the ways the world they have been born into is organised, they pick up the fact power differentials and white privilege, even if they don't yet understand the specific categories. The black child is likely to be surrounded by adults sufficiently resilient about discussing the concern to help them understand and manage what they are discovering about the world and their place in it. However, white liberal parents are more likely to become embarrassed, hush the child, ignore or distract them, or resort to the shortcut of colour blindness by insisting that everyone is the same and equal. Such an assertion is not only untrue and denies what the child has observed and experienced. By focusing on the universality of humans, the message is conveyed that it is the recognition of difference that is the cause of racism, rather than the fact that the child has been born into a social system that discriminates against certain groups, which they need help to acknowledge, understand, and begin to think through their responses. Ryan Parker writes that as a result, white children learn to disconnect, to stop thinking, to stop noticing, to stop linking reality and history, and to turn off their empathic curiosity and care. If allowed to develop, this curiosity and care would cause problems for whiteness's power and the privileges it claims and protects, for it would result in recognition of reality, which eventually might lead to responsibility taking and reparation. In most other aspects of her or his life, the child in a modern white liberal family can take their curiosity about the world to the significant adults in their life. For the majority of the time, their experience will be of lively engagement, attention, and interest. When they raise the matter of differences concerning race and ethnicity, and they are responded to with the sterility of a blanket, colourblind position, the lively, engaged presence they had known previously disappears, and they are faced with a blankness, a shutting down, and a silencing. There is a deadness which relates to the subject, and the child quickly learns that the topic is not welcome for discussion. Their curiosity in developing concern for others, their preoccupation with the troubled matter of social fairness, is shut down, and the vertical split of disavowal develops within the psyche. In psychoanalytic theory, an internal conflict may lead to the creation of horizontal splits, where aspects of the self are repressed, made unconscious, and denied. Whilst also a defensive process, disavowal develops within the ego when it is faced with two conflicting realities, causing a vertical split within the psyche. Unlike repression, the individual remains conscious of both sides of the split, but will disavow either to meet internal desires and needs or minimize anxiety. Thus, I can know the reality of the consequences of my behavior, but will disregard that awareness in order to satisfy my desires, my omnipotence, and my narcissistic sense of entitlement. Disavowal for the white liberal splits the investment in white privilege together with its racist underpinning on one side, and the need to maintain a sense of oneself as good on the other. Because of the numbing effect of colourblindness, a void is created between the two, a silent gap which lacks the capacity for mourning or symbolisation, which Adrienne Harris, borrowing from Andre Green, calls a psychose blanche. Harris also takes Ruth Stein's concept of the perverse pact to suggest that such a contract operates unconsciously between white individuals and groups to ensure that white privilege is maintained whilst looking like work-on change is taking place. There is not the space to develop this here, but what I want to emphasise is how deeply embedded and collective our racist structures are. Confronting them is no casual matter, but requires commitment and hard, in-depth work. I had once assumed that the profession of psychoanalytic psychotherapy would be especially open to the challenge, as at our heart is a recognition and awareness of unconscious dynamics within the psyche that have a profound effect on our thoughts and actions. I assumed we would be keen to understand our hidden racism and bring our analytic skills to the table in order to address the problem. I now believe that there are aspects of our thinking and our ways of training and structuring ourselves that contrive to ensure we convince ourselves that really there is no problem to address, and that if there is, then only small adjustments are required. Thus, we collude in what Bob Young describes as a loud silence. The Macpherson inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence defined institutional racism as the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture, or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. It is incumbent on every institution to examine their policies and the outcome of their policies and practices to guard against disadvantaging any section of our community. The psychoanalytic establishment is as susceptible to institutionalised racism as any other. However, the urgency and commitment that can be found in other professions, such as social work, medicine, academia, etc., is markedly lacking in that of ours. I don't think I have ever heard any blatantly racist statement made by a colleague. On the contrary, the language is usually of disapproval of racist dynamics within society. Most people I know are politically left of centre. Many have worked in the public sector prior to training, and all express a concern for the mental well-being throughout the population. And yet, as an institution, there has been remarkably little real change. Andrew Cooper writes, institutional racism is both a manifestation of organisational resistance to change and a main source of that resistance. But tackling institutional racism is about the pursuit of ordinariness, about creating conditions wherein, at a minimum, organisations fully affect the ordinariness of a multi-ethnic society. Within the multi-ethnic environments of today, the fact that one can find organisational enclaves apparently almost untouched by these changes is surely evidence of something deeper and more troubling. Almost without exception, I suggest, the major institutions of psychoanalytic psychotherapy and psychotherapy training in this country are just such enclaves. I mentioned above that there's a general silence in this profession regarding racism and a denial that we have a problem. This is not quite true, as the matter is raised on an infrequent but regular basis. From time to time, during gatherings of colleagues in committees, working groups, conferences, etc., someone will point out the whiteness of most, if not all, of the group. We all nod and agree the matter needs serious attention, and there follows a discussion of what might be done. The conversation becomes increasingly desultory and fades away. Then the subject disappears from agendas altogether until, some months later, as if obeying an implicit rule, the subject will be raised again. We go round and round the same circle, and effectively nothing changes. Ellis describes above the response should a black person persist beyond what seems to be the allotted time allowed for debate. If a white person does so, there is far less risk, but there will be a general irritation, and they are likely to be labelled, perhaps not as a troublemaker, but as someone with a problem. I can't separate myself from this depressing procedure, having played my part many times in these institutionalised practices. But I'm coming to believe that these discussions are themselves part of a complicit, unconscious contract we are all engaging to ensure against the radical change that is required. People feel caught in a catch-22 of wanting to increase the diversity of the group, but the pool of available black colleagues is limited and they can't be everywhere. Besides, there are worrying questions of tokenism, of looking to black people to save us, whilst we assume a position of helplessness. We have plenty of evidence open and available to us, both of the experience of black people in the profession and proposals for ways forward in the form of research reports, papers and articles. It seems we are unable to imagine questions we might ask ourselves, actions we might take, feelings we could explore, and ways of doing so. Instead, we are left in a state of apparent paralysis, as if there is nothing to be done, and with apparent regret and a sigh of relief, we move on. Robin DiAngelo notes that to continue reproducing racial inequality, the system only needs white people to be really nice and carry on, smile at people of colour, be friendly across race, and go to lunch together on occasions. I'm not saying you shouldn't be nice. I suppose it's better than being mean, but niceness is not courageous. Niceness will not get racism on the table and will not keep it on the table when everyone wants it off. In fact, bringing racism to white people's attention is often seen as not nice, and being perceived as not nice triggers white fragility. Because white fragility finds its support and is a function of white privilege, fragility and privilege result in responses that function to restore equilibrium and return the resources lost via the challenge, such as resistance towards the trigger, shutting down and or tuning out, indulgence in emotional incapacitation, such as guilt or hurt feelings, exiting, or a combination of these responses. White fragility is not a weakness, but a means of maintaining the privilege of whiteness. This fragility takes the form of colour blindness that bypasses the realities of inequality and negates the need for engagement with the consequences of disparity and discrimination. This means we are unused to participating in ordinary conversations about the fact of that privilege and its implications. We have nothing like the resilience of Black friends and colleagues with whom honest engagement becomes fraught with our anxiety, defensiveness, and denial. Discussions around racism in the profession often have a dead feel to them, as if we are going through the motions until, lacking libidinal investment, the conversation dribbles away and we can return to things as they were. I'm coming to see such familiar discussions as a form of institutional ritual that acts to patch over the gap created by disavowal, so that it is never properly faced and worked with. It serves the dual purpose of allowing us to feel we are doing something, that we are being nice, whilst actually ensuring that nothing really changes. Both the theory and method of psychoanalysis and Jungian analysis contains an exasperating polarity that makes it both profoundly radical and also deeply conservative. Gilman points out that at the time when Freud and his followers were working on this new theory in Vienna, Jews were thought of as blacks, and therefore psychoanalysis as a black thing. At the start, the project developed at the margins of society and spoke its radical message from that position. As Freud and his followers left Germany and Austria and moved elsewhere, they needed to fit in, find acceptance, and establish a place within the privileged world of the white middle classes of the UK and the Americas. The price of this contract was the omission of race and social class from its discourse, and consequently the increased homogeneity of its members, such that today, looking around most gatherings of psychoanalytic psychotherapists, one could be forgiven for thinking that psychoanalysis has now become a white thing. When a black thing turns into a white thing, we might well wonder what processes of disavowal and repression are at work. Neil Altman states that as a black thing in a white society, psychoanalysis attained the power of the outsider to gain perspective, to critique, to see in the dark. A large share of the value of psychoanalysis derives from the ability of Freud and his followers to bring to light, to bring to light that which was disavowed and repressed. In Becoming White in America, psychoanalysts forfeited some of that night vision, most particularly with respect to our own social, meaning racial and class position, and the ways this process might be reflected in clinical work. The position we have on the polarity is reversed, but the polarity remains, and so we find ourselves needing and resisting the critique, the psychoanalytic intervention of those we have left out. Altman's book is called The Analyst in the Inner City. He points out that historically, psychoanalysis is largely eschewed concerned with inner city public clinic work. Psychoanalysts concentrated on private practice, where conditions were more neatly fitted the classical ideal, and where, not incidentally, there was more money to be made. The British psychoanalyst Harvey Taylor, in his discussion paper, notes that at the 1918 Budapest International Conference, Freud and the early pioneers agreed that psychoanalysis would develop along three fronts: research, training, and subsidized clinics. Owing to the inflation and political developments in Eastern Europe, only the training option was developed, supported by a limited research effort based on the case history. The abandonment of the subsidized clinic and of the discourse around race and class has deprived the discipline of a width of human experience and narrowed the field of knowledge. There are those in the psychoanalytic community who, like Altman, work in public health settings, in prisons, working class community projects with the homeless and the poor, and have first-hand experience of the impact of social injustice and oppression on the individual and the family. Yet they have little say in the formulation of our clinical theory. We rarely hear case presentations involving shop assistants, migrant workers, lorry drivers, or care workers. Jennifer Tollison, in her ironically titled paper, Saving the World One Patient at a Time, notes that working from the margins, these clinicians have contact with our culture's hidden subjectivities, which comprise hidden, subjugated knowledges that remain sadly outside our formidable intelligence as a profession. The radical potential of psychoanalysis is expressed by Harris, who asserts that the method of psychoanalysis is a commitment to looking at both what is hidden in silence and in plain sight. Psychoanalysis, at its most unflinching and courageous, allows us to maintain curiosity at the strange, fuzzy, unreasoning moments in the psyche and in the culture. In this way, psychoanalysis has the potential to be, in part, a revolutionary practice. However, the conservative pool resists taking on the revolutionary implications of our understanding when it comes to developing and supporting a radical practice in relation to race. Melanie Souchet writes, within psychoanalysis, the place of race in the construction of subjectivity has always been minimized. A curious omission, given that the formation of the subject is a field of study. Discussions of race today remain largely limited to an investigation of otherness when someone of a different colour enters the consulting room. Further, the burden of writing about race has until very recently fallen on those with darker skins, who have been trying to tell us for decades that a racialized subjectivity is crucial. Our theories presume and perpetuate a division between inner and outer, between the psyche and the social, where the former is considered the proper subject for psychoanalysis. This can lead to an assumption, not always explicit, that injustices such as racism are outer social world phenomena, therefore are little of no relevance to analytic inquiry. Traditionally, our theories isolate the individual from their social world, and we prioritize the personal over the political, although the recent developments such as relational psychoanalysis seek to reinstate the link. Dalal challenges the assumptions behind the usual psychoanalytic perspectives, which he sees as locating the cause of racism as an internal world dynamic rather than in the social world. He says, in my opinion, the problems thrown up in this territory shed light on a more general difficulty in psychoanalytic theories, the difficulty born of a false distinction between the developmental and socialization process. In academia, there's a debate about the validity of any division between the internal and the external, and the implications of isolating one from the other. Stephen Frosch and Lisa Baretza, for example, argue that the division is a way of doing politics, and the psychosocial becomes a contrary way of doing politics, a rebellion that asserts that you cannot have one without the other, that they are warp and weft and signifier and signified, and so on through the different ways of saying that they are two sides of the same thing. In his response to the paper, Paul Hoggart takes issue with the idea that the distinction should be dissolved entirely, asserting a belief that the internal and external worlds, whilst overlapping and mutually constituting, are also irreducible to one another. I came across this intriguing and thought-provoking debate within psychosocial studies in my research for the book. It struck me that our profession ought to be more actively involved in the conversation, both because of what we might contribute and what we could learn. It was not the first time I stumbled on a perspective from outside of the world of clinicians that challenged a set of age-old assumptions and woke up my thinking. It underlined how insulated we are from other disciplines. In our conferences, seminars and journals, we tend to talk mostly to ourselves, generally confirming or expanding slightly what we already know. It seems we are missing out on a world of thinking and debate which we might find stimulating, original and helpful, for we could do with collapsing a little of the old categories of the individual and the social, the internal and the external, and find better ways of theorizing how human suffering can be both personal and collective. To turn to the libraries of other specialities, even those who are our friends, requires a certain humility, which I fear can be lacking in our world. Doubtless all disciplines have their certainties, but ours seem particularly prone to complacency. There is a tendency, possibly exacerbated by external attack, towards a position of arrogance where our theories are spoken as if they were the truth. Sometimes when we take psychoanalytic thinking out into society, we do so as if we bring a golden thing for which the world should be grateful. A humility is required of us, one that recognizes we too have much to learn. To borrow from Bion, psychoanalysis is just one stripe on the coat of the tiger. Proschen breaks again. Many psychosocial researchers share the traditional sociological suspicion of psychoanalysis because of its strong individualizing tendencies, or those who've been most influenced by post-structuralist and/or discursive perspectives resist the top-down, expert knowledge, epistemological strategies of psychoanalysis, with their apparent certainties about the true nature of human subjectivity, accompanied by an interpretive practice that always seems to know best, or at least to know subjects better than they know themselves. I wonder if one of the strengths of our craft, the fact that all psychoanalytic psychotherapists are required to be in analysis throughout our trainings, might also be a weakness. Perhaps there is a tendency to an unconscious, even conscious, belief in what I have now come to think of as the myth of the complete analysis, which leads to complacency as if somehow we've got things more or less sorted. This is particularly dangerous when talking about race. Given most white members have had analysis with a white analyst, I suspect the analysand will not have spent many sessions exploring their racism. Certainly I don't recall the subject ever coming up in mine. So I'm often surprised by the certainty I meet in individuals, as if there really is nothing further that needs consideration or thought about oneself. There are many thoughtful, socially concerned and politically aware people within the profession who are troubled by injustice and discriminatory practices and are genuine in their wish to make a difference. But we work against deep conscious and unconscious dynamics that operate in ourselves as individuals and in our institutions, and we need to recognize and be careful of these undercurrents and their effects if we are to take on the hard work that is needed if real change is to come about. I suggest the usual discussions that many will be familiar with are not only futile, but part of the defensive structures that serve to act against the radical change that is needed. If such structures are there to defend our white privilege, then radical change will require acknowledgement of that privilege and letting it go, giving it up. There will be loss and discomfort, but I argue that our liberal justice and knowledge-seeking concerned selves will gain immeasurably. The following are just some ideas of how we might take this work forward. 1. A radical review of the theories we use through a series of reading groups and group discussions is needed. There's a paucity of material within the analytic text that offers a thorough critique of the colonial roots of some of the terms we use, and we will need to borrow heavily from those in academia such as psychosocial studies, philosophy and social work. There are colleagues in the departments who understand and are sympathetic to psychoanalytic theory, but have also researched and written about the more questionable history and modern day implications. Recently, in my own organisation, the British Jungian Analytic Association, within the BPF, groups of us have met to explore potentially troubling concepts such as the primitive, inner and outer, and the more Jungian concepts of animus anima and participation mystique. For each meeting, we read 2 papers on the topic, usually from contrasting perspectives, and then met to discuss. According to the responses from those involved, this has led to an organic revision for some of those concepts and a rethink of the way we work and teach. Certainly the energy generated has been in considerable contrast with the flat, deadly discussions we usually have about racism, gender and sexuality. I gather that the word critique and crisis have a common etymological origin. Certainly members of the group reported a sense of crisis in thought in this process of critiquing long accepted, previously unquestioned theories, but most seemed to feel it was a crisis worth weathering. 2, a greater vigilance regarding language and text is required. The writings of our analytic forebears, sadly especially Jung, is peppered with assumptions, pronouncements and language which is ugly and abusive. As a white analyst, teacher and supervisor, it is my responsibility to see and to question and be disturbed by the disturbing and questionable material. I need to imagine what it might feel like to have one's ancestors referred to as savage or primitive. Either I must leave such texts off the reading list, or I must introduce them in a manner that acknowledges the hurt they may cause and open up and facilitate the conversation about the implications. This must be done whether there is a black person present or not, for if we train white analysts to believe there is nothing to notice, nothing to be concerned about, then the abuse continues and we cripple the future growth of therapists. 3, from an organisational perspective, a thorough evaluation of all aspects of its life, from monitoring systems, policies, structures, etc., need to be undertaken by each training and or membership or regulatory body. Frank Lowe writes, there must be a systematic review of analytic organisations' ways of functioning in terms of whether and how they disadvantage Black and minority communities. This would include the selection of psychotherapists for training, content of training programs and the supervision arrangements. Overall, this is about changing organisational culture and developing a non-defensive but non-persecutory approach to exploring racism rather than avoidance, denial and splitting it off from awareness at the intrapsychic, interpersonal, group and organisational level. 4, we can utilise ways familiar to us, such as seminars, scientific meetings and conferences for deepening our understanding of how racism operates. I suggest we also need to explore the live, intra and interpsychic emotional processes of racism. Group relations events help to bypass the intellectualising defences and can offer safe though not necessarily comfortable spaces for people to contemplate racism on a personal level. It may be important to hold in mind that the radical conservative binary that runs as a thread through our theory and practice also runs through us as organisations, groups and individuals. We need to stay alert to the splitting of the binary, where we both take up one of the polarised positions and deny and disown the opposite. This will lead again to organisational stuckness. We might need external support and consultancy to help us with this. Joel Cavell uses the term saturate to describe the way in which racism has penetrated every corner of the society into which we are all born. There's no position one can take which is outside it. If we acknowledge the racist backdrop to our world, then we also have to recognise the particularly prejudicial veil, which is the inheritance of all white members of this society. The veil may be one of cordiality, but it has guilt, shame and envy woven into it, which freezes our curiosity about each other and prevents us from having ordinary conversations about the realities of the impact of racism. In his book, Partisans in an Uncertain World, Paul Hoggett says, uncritical thought will not simply be passive, but will actively cling to a belief in the appearance of certain things, It actively refuses, rejects as perverse or crazy any view that may contradict it. To think critically, one must therefore be able to use aggression to break through the limitations of one's own assumptions, or to challenge the squatting rights of the colonizer within one's own internal world. Given the fact of global colonization by white Western culture, for us who are defined as belonging to such a culture, we can, if we choose, avoid external pressure to make that act of aggression that challenges the squatting rights of the internal colonizer. But not noticing this figure who inhabits at least a corner of our minds demanding compliance does not mean he does not exist. I suggest that we are the poorer if we do not attempt the act of aggression to break through our assumptions, for they then remain an area of psychic life that is unexamined. The stubbornness of the uncritical thought that actively clings to a belief in the appearance of certain things, in Hoggett's quote, may give us a clue to a belief, may give us a clue to the tenacity of the fact of racism, despite our wish that it were not so. For me to think differently about my place in the world and the privileges it has brought me requires an undoing of a well-laid system of assumptions about myself. The fact that these assumptions existed and continue to exist does not make me an inherently bad person, but to break through their limitations is hard work. This is not an easy subject to play with. It raises feelings of guilt, shame, envy, denial, and defiance, all of which are hard enough to face in the privacy of one's own life. To explore it publicly can bring up a fear of getting it wrong, of saying the unforgivable, and of exposing an internal badness. But when white people choose to stay blind, deaf, and silent concerning our own privilege and its impact on the Black other, we are opting to remain unconscious of a crucial aspect of our lives and of ourselves. This part of our shadow has been whitewashed out of view, but then what colours, what potential, what depth might we be missing? I recall seeing a poster once many years ago. A white man was being carried on a black man's back, who was weighed down with a burden. The text gave the white man's word, which went something like, "I will care for you, empathise with you, weep for you, for the load you have to carry. One thing I won't do is get off your back." There is no doubt that the greater suffering is shouldered by the black man, but the picture is not a healthy one for either. We white people need to climb down, stand on our own 2 feet and walk, for the sake of justice, but also for our own health, our own individuation, our own peace of mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. It's a tough thing to be speaking on your own, and I'm just going to unmute everybody so that they can respond and show their appreciation.
Helen.
Thank you, Helen.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, after that very, very interesting talk by Helen, I'm going to go straight on, and I'm going to introduce to you now Frank Lowe, who is going to respond to Helen's paper. So Frank Lowe, who I'm sure you also are familiar with, he's a psychoanalytic psychotherapist and a consultant social worker at the Tavistock Clinic. He's written several papers on race and psychotherapy, and he's developed services at the Tavistock to make psychotherapy more accessible to Black and minority ethnic people. He's edited this book, Thinking Space, promoting thinking about race, culture, and diversity in psychotherapy and beyond. And that arises out of a regular learning forum called Thinking Space that he's run at the Tavistock to address diversity issues ever since 2002. So Frank, it's over to you now.
Thank you, Juliet. I wonder what feelings were aroused in you during Helen's talk. I think our feelings are often a more accurate reflection of the true self than the words we use. So you can make a note, if you wish, mental or otherwise, of the feelings that you were aroused in you during Helen's talk. I think it might be a useful source to draw on in the breakout groups. And even if you don't share it, I think it might be a source of learning about the self that is useful. I've made a lot of notes listening to Helen's talk, and I certainly don't have the time to share them all. I would like to commend Helen Morgan for being one of the leading white voices in psychotherapy in the UK on race. She has published many papers, including Fear and Blindness, a very important paper in my view. And her forthcoming book will make an invaluable contribution to the struggle to decolonize psychotherapy. The foundation of Western culture and Britain's place in the world is strongly based on the colonization of the New World, which included North and South America, Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, among others. The looting of land, gold, invaluable artifacts from these countries, many of which are in British institutions like the British Museum, Victoria and Albert, and so on, and the enslavement of Africans to work on their plantations, look after their children, fight their wars, enrich their countries, in particular Britain, who, as you know, had the biggest empire. Race and racism is a core characteristic of Western culture, arising from colonization and slavery. It is an entrenched part of the legacy of 5 centuries of the enrichment of white colonizers and their descendants, who regard themselves as superior, and the debasing and impoverishment of the colonized, who continue to be regarded as inferior. Western civilization has been built on racism, and it is deeply embedded in our culture and our psyches. So Joel Covell, as Helen has said, his use of the word saturate is absolutely accurate. And the historian, David Olosoga, recently said that racism is systemic. It is deeply hardwired into our culture, into our language, and it affects all of us. Frantz Fanon has testified to that in his classic book, Black Skin, White Mask. It's not just an issue that is embedded in the psyche of white people. It affects all of us, including the way we interact with each other. As psychotherapists, we cannot turn a blind eye to race and racism in the psyche. Lennox Thomas rightly states, as Helen has quoted, that psychotherapists must recognize and take responsibility for their racism. I also agree with Helen quoting Dubois that white silence, like white fragility, is a defense, a form of denial, a means of maintaining white privilege. I think this conference, this gathering, particularly white colleagues, should think about white silence. It is a reality. And yes, consider how it should be addressed. I don't consider, I think, white fragility as, I don't think it is a weakness. I think it's a means of maintaining the privilege of whiteness. I think our psychotherapy institutions and our culture is changing, but it is changing very slowly. I wonder how much Helen's experience as a trainee, how many years ago, Helen? How much has it changed? How radically has it changed since Helen's training? A colleague and I, Agnes Bryan, ran a course called Black Leadership in White Organizations. And it arose from my experience of the challenges, the struggles that Black leaders, senior people within organizations faced, employed on the basis of organizations who stated they were committed to equal opportunities. And the battles and difficulties such managers had needed a space to help them to cope with the challenges of leading within white organizations. And we can think about psychotherapy organizations as white organizations. Helen is right to wonder if one of the strengths of our craft, the fact that all psychotherapists are required to be in analysis throughout their training, but might it also be a weakness? Because not only is there an arrogance for some that they have had an analysis, but in my training experience, there was very little opportunity to think about these matters as regards race and racism. There was no deep reflection on these matters throughout my training. Betty Joseph says, personal analysis, it is hoped, will help the trainee work out a number of his or her own internal conflicts in a more satisfactory and adaptive way, so that he or she will bring, at least to the therapeutic situation, a mental apparatus better able to be objective in his or her work with patients. Psychotherapy organizations, by turning a blind eye to this dimension of the psyche and of our culture, and I think it continues to do so, although there has been some improvements, I think really has to be addressed more seriously, and that will involve some significant change within psychotherapy organizations to really achieve this. Although race has featured more in the curriculum, I think, over the past decade or so, I think turning a blind eye is still an apt description of what is happening in psychotherapy training organizations. As John Steiner describes, we seem to have access to reality, but choose to ignore it because it proves convenient to do so. He describes this mechanism of turning a blind eye because he thinks it conveys the right degree of ambiguity as to how conscious or unconscious this knowledge is. And again, I think it's something that should hopefully be considered in the breakout groups, how conscious or unconscious this is. Is psychotherapy training, in my experience, although there has been some progress since I trained, there is still not enough space to think about race and racism. It is often too little space, too tokenistic, and for many, more disempowering rather than empowering, particularly, from my experience, Black and minority ethnic trainees. So So it is still absent in analysis, in my knowledge, from what I've heard from others, marginal in the curriculum. Silence of the white majority continues to be a feature. And many BME trainees feel oppressed sometimes, become tired of being the only ones who speak about race and lose motivation in doing so. A number of issues arose listening to Helen's talk. One of them, she has mentioned the Black and Asian Therapist Network. I think it is a symptom of psychotherapy organizations. Black and minority ethnic trainees, as I was, needed a space where these experiences could be addressed and taught about. I think the continuation of the Black and Asian Therapist Network is necessary, but it should not be an alternative. There need to be spaces within white psychotherapy organizations that Black and Asian and other minorities can have space to think and talk about racism, both in formal structures, but also informal as well. One of the questions which arose to me from Helen's talk is, why would white people give up power and privilege, be it societally, institutionally, culturally, individually? Now, Think in Space, which have been running since 2002, was created to provide a space where these matters could be taught about. Three things have struck me over the years about Think in Space. I'm going to repeat this. Many BME trainees have informed me that they still need a safe space to speak and think about their experience of race and racism within their training organization. So the idea of going outside of the organization, which is necessary, is not satisfactory. The matter is, how much at home do they feel in the organization? Another feature I've learned is that white trainees who attend find it more difficult to talk and are more often silent in the large group. Speaking in smaller groups is easier, that's certainly the case. And thirdly, at a recent Think in Space, this happened this week actually, earlier this week, a Think in Space at the Tavistock, open to trainees and students, in a very, very short time after it was announced, was completely sold out. I think it's partly to do with Black Lives Matter. It has really surfaced the continued traumatic nature of racism in our societies, not just America, which has moved a number of people who have wanted to engage with this in a positive way. In this Think in Space, the issue of participating in an open discussion, because that's what Think in Space tries to do, was noted to be very difficult. The white trainees and students who were there reflected that in the way they participated. But they wished to find a way of creating methods that would enable that dialogue to become less difficult. And 3 suggestions were made. No conclusion was reached because we came to the end by the time we got there. One suggestion was that we should have white-only spaces during a thinking space. So when the group breaks into smaller group, probably there should be white-only spaces. Will that be less of an inhibitor if you're in a white-only space, was one suggestion. There was also a suggestion that there should be black-only spaces as well. And then there was an idea about, well, there are people who are of mixed heritage. So these ideas came up. A conclusion wasn't reached, but I thought there may have been some value in these ideas, which I'm certainly going to explore further. And I don't think this is only relevant to thinking space. So it wasn't an either or position that you create spaces for particular groups to meet and talk, but you also create spaces for them to come together. Lastly, at a recent team event I facilitated in a mental health trust, a white clinician shared, that was very late in the team event, that she was married to a black man and had a mixed race adolescent child. And everyone in the group, these are team members, they've worked for many years together, seemed a bit surprised to hear this. She was perceived as a white woman. And what assumptions came with that perception? And she shared a bit about her son and her husband and their lives, and how she, as a white middle-class clinician, how her life is affected by race. What it demonstrated to me, and you may think this is obvious, is how much, because I had made an assumption about her as well. Because when we started the team event, she introduced herself as white middle class, which she hasn't changed that view that she's not white middle class. But what emerged later in the session was about that dimension of her life, which came after. So not only the assumptions we make, but what we project onto people on the basis of race. It's very, very alive in our relationships. It will not be easy, but decolonizing our institutions and our minds have a long way to go, but I think we can do it. I think I may have taken up all my time, Juliet.
Wait a minute.
Yes, it is time.
You're
Okay.
just at the end, Frank.
I will stop there.
Okay. And now I'm just going to talk about the group, what happens in the group, the breakout groups. As I say, you've got until 12:15, and it's time for a discussion, but it's a focused discussion, really. And what we're asking you to do is to think for yourself, feel for yourself as well, in the way that Frank mentioned, and ask this question, having heard what you've heard, having felt what you felt, what am I going to do now? Having heard what I've heard, having felt what I felt, what am I going to do now? And then the breakout space is for you to discuss this with people in the group. And we're also going to give the group a task so that 10 minutes before the end of the time, I'll send a message to your group to remind you of this. And 10 minutes towards the end of the time, you need to bring your focus to agreeing one main point that you would bring back to the main meeting. And this point is the the action point of most urgency or most importance. So you'll need to work in your group to agree that, and to select one of your members in the group who can then type that point into the chat function. That'll happen when you come back into the main meeting. All right? So in the last 10 minutes, you need to gather yourselves to really agree what is the main action point that your group is going to put up in the chat, and then you'll appoint someone in your group to type that in once you come back into the main meeting.
Okay, so this is the final plenary, which will last until 5 to 1, when we'll just do a sort of winding up. And the point of this is to give us a chance to talk amongst ourselves, to share ideas and reactions about the day, and to look at, I hope, the proposals that you will all post on the chat. We'll all be able to see those. So we're inviting you to talk now, and just to point out that this isn't the missing question and answer session after the speakers. This is literally a plenary process. So we would like to hear as many voices as possible. So we're inviting you to take turns to speak. It's obviously difficult to have a kind of discussion on this medium, but we'll do our best.
Okay, I can see that Philip Hewitt has a hand raised. Philip, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and then you can speak.
Thank you. I promise I will be very brief. But firstly, to thank Helen and Frank for the talk this morning. Very important, very interesting, very challenging, which I'm sure we all want to take forward in some way. I briefly wanted to say, I trained with Lennox Thomas in the same training group at the BAP, years ago, and it was, I was terribly saddened to hear of his death, and it was an extraordinary experience in a way when I look back on it, because we went through the years of training without really much discussion of his presence in the group. In fact, whenever we tried to, well, as I remember it, whenever we tried to talk about group dynamics, generally our teachers would have stopped us from doing that and kept focused on the task of the group, which was whatever it was. So my experience of the BAP in those days was, with hindsight, was very negative, and missed out so much of the kind of discussion that we have now and should be having continually. I should emphasize that it was the BAP on the Freudian side of the house, not the Jungian. Whether that made a difference or not, I don't know. So very important that we're able to begin to look at these issues. And I think one of the things that I need for myself is my training, my old training hasn't stood, I don't think it stood in the way of me learning. It's actually gave me a platform from which to grow, I hope, grow from, and still growing, believe it or not. But the thing is, what I know that I need, and part of my reason for being here today, is that I need more space and time to think and work through these issues with colleagues of all backgrounds. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Philip. Very interesting things coming up on the chat.
You can't see any more hands at the moment. Okay, Barbara, you raised your hand. Can you unmute yourself?
Sure. Let me just go back to the notes that I've made so that I. So we spoke about beginning with acknowledging that things are not okay. And to acknowledge that this work is going to take time, which was echoed with the previous person who's just spoken. To acknowledge that the courage that it takes to create the change. And then we also spoke about creating anti-racist policies in institutions to change the culture of institutions and to truly embody them, rather than the worry that they would become tick box exercises, but to really explore and hold how we've all been colonized and how we all need to dismantle that.
Yeah.
And to create space to genuinely and authentically meet each other. And we spoke about the difficulty that it is for white practitioners to bring race into a clinical space. And perhaps there should be space on training institutions to speak about that, because I mean, there's a lot of evidence that the idea of a blank slate therapist can be quite traumatizing. So I think that was about it.
Yes, really helpful.
Okay, I can see that there's Paul Casman and Nick Benefield are waiting to speak. Paul first, do you want to unmute yourself, Paul?
Can you hear me? Yep, I can.
We
so
can. Yeah.
Our feedback really from our group was really acknowledging that the conversation took place in a doubly marginalized place. That we're talking with like-minded people who have an interest and a wish to address issues of race and racism within therapy. So we were actually very mindful that this particular environment doesn't necessarily reflect the broader environment of therapy. And also noted that of the 9 group members, the 2 minority members of the group were the white members of the group, which again inverted the normal process that people will experience And within the conversation, I think a lot of the pain that that BME trainees had felt during their training was expressed. A lot of the frustrations that they'd experienced were revisited. And there was a real sense of exhaustion from both BME and white participants, which was acknowledged would be coming from different places, but nevertheless very real. And I think the point that we arrived at was, or the aspiration that we arrived at, was really that rather than race and diversity and racism being an optional extra, or a single module in a training program. I think somebody already used the word tick box exercise, that actually we recognize that the issues and challenges and emotions and impacts of being BME in this society are things that are lived and experienced every day, and as such should be mainstreamed, and that they're as real as attachment issues, but given very, very different emphasis and place. So that was the point that we ended up at.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Nick, I think you're next to speak.
Actually, Paul's covered the point I was particularly going to pick up, but it is just worth saying that, because I think the mixture of joy and excitement coupled with anxiety following the talk this morning was quite strong, but it's the real ground shattering kind of state really is that, as Paul said, that the reaching the point of thinking, if we're to really give race its place in relation to the importance it is to human development in our worlds, then actually it's as important as anything that psychoanalysis would lay down as a fundamental process like attachment. And that, if you think about that and how important but how radical that would be to get that accepted, that's a very big matter, and it should be a goal really, but I hadn't heard it in quite that way when Paul raised it in the group. Very interesting.
Thanks. And Carol, you're wanting to speak, Carol Leader? You need to unmute yourself. Yep.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, it's just been such a fascinating morning, and thanks very much to the two speakers. I mean, I wanted to say that one of our group members, Mary, couldn't speak. There was a problem. And so she sort of wrote down our notes for us and listened. And one of the ideas we came up was that we would like a thinking space in BPF, although we would like to open it to other people, because we're a largely white organisation, which is the problem, I think. But also, I want to particularly pick up what Philip was talking about, the need in our group that we talked about towards the end of the trainers needing to be trained, because it's, you know, we're mostly white and we want to open up the issues, but actually if those issues are raised, as Philip said, in his time, trainers simply didn't know how to deal with it. And we were hearing about how the Minster Centre has set up seminars, mandatory seminars, for all seminar leaders to learn how to deal with these issues as part of any seminar, and I think that's a great idea.
Curtis de Leon, do you want to unmute yourself and speak?
Hi, I mean, I was in the same group as Carol and with Mary. I just say it was quite a powerful experience, and I kind of wondered about it. And we kind of made some connections with it, that Mary being mute throughout the whole small group, and what that experience must have been like for her. But she was desperately, and you can see, wanting to get in. And I suppose there was a response from the group. I think it was very caring. It was very responsive. We could recognize and identify with her struggle to speak up and not be heard. She can hear us, but we couldn't hear her. And it was just something very powerful about, you know, all sorts of thoughts, but one being, You know, is she white privilege? You know, is she, because of white privilege, getting the response for not leaving her out, for trying to include her as much as we could? So we denoted the fact that she can go into the chat, and we tried really, really hard, but it was something quite important about her not being able to speak, and the effort that we might have afforded her to keep her part of the group. And I wondered if that's the sort of experience that, you know, Black people feel, actually, that they are unable to speak, but that society doesn't respond to them in a way that they can speak up. So it was very, very powerful experience we felt with her. But she stayed with us throughout. It was just something quite responsive, and I don't know how she felt about it. Maybe she might say, but just wanted to highlight that.
There aren't any hands raised at the moment, but I'm just wondering if I can take this opportunity to respond to what Carol said, particularly about training the trainers and sort of ways in which to get people involved. And Helen mentioned the reading groups that we've been doing, the peer reading groups that we've been doing at the BJAA. And what struck me about those is that they're not about something, you know, that we have to do. There was a real energy and response and interest in getting involved. And as we've been talking about taking those discussions forward, we've been thinking about research. And we had a meeting yesterday where there was a point that really struck me about that research, and the way that we might, you know, really examine some of the themes that come up in one of our discussions. So one of our groups was, for example, thinking about the use of the word primitive. And if we really examined that and explored the themes that were in that, something would come from that experience of doing that, interacting with the material in the way that we do in a psychotherapy situation, where we're open to finding out what we might discover and trying to hold a not knowing place. That through doing that, the hope is that our practice changes. And I think there's something about that engagement that is a way of shifting something within ourselves, our white selves, speaking personally. I can see Gita has her hand raised. Gita, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that we raised in our group was really about the sort of power relationships. So when you think about distribution of resources, for example, in the NHS or in the voluntary sector, where, you know, the organisations that are working with Black and minority patients in a sort of intercultural way are getting a lot less funding and resources than the mainstream white organisations. And I suppose we talked about how that's not just something that we have to do or we should do, but it's actually impacting on the services that are delivered to Black and minority patients. And that is a real worry, because people are missing out on the quality psychotherapy that they should be receiving from public funds, really. You know, when you look at one sector NHS, there are so many organisations that are not working interculturally, that are mainly white therapists, but still have maybe 50–60% of Black and minority clients who are not receiving the service that they should be receiving. So I suppose it's thinking in our group, we were talking about, it's also about the power, you know, who holds the power to change the system, because we can constantly talk about, you know, racism and how it should change and how it's terrible and we should get this, we should get that. But unless people who actually have the power to change things are doing this work, it's hard to see how things will change. And that includes, you know, distribution of resources and who decides who gets funding for projects or work with Black minority people. So, and psychotherapy is inaccessible pretty much to, you know, becoming more inaccessible, I think, actually, to Black and minority people. So there is that sort of issue about service delivery. And training is part of that, but it's also about how you deliver the services. Otherwise, I think somebody in our group said people just sort of absent themselves. So Black and minority people stop accessing psychotherapy services just because it's not for them, and that is a really sad thing. So how to to promote the idea that psychotherapy is for everyone and should be definitely in publicly funded organisations, but somehow it doesn't really get accessed. I mean, I've heard quite a lot of comments about refugees can't use psychotherapy in my career, because I've done quite a lot of work with refugees. A lot of therapists still believe that refugees can't use psychotherapy. So it's those kind of attitudes. Well, actually, everyone can. It's the psychotherapy that needs to change, not the clients that you're bringing in. So we did have a conversation about that in our group as well.
Excuse me, I can see a lot of hands raised now. Let's see, we've got at least 3 more. Abby, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. I wanted to say that there is a knowledge amongst people of colour about this issue of race and racism, because we are the recipient of it, so we know what it is. And I just can't wait for the white majority to catch up on this, because it's so important. And because the training is predominantly white. And my concern really is more in the area of mental health, because as practitioners, we need to get more versed with understanding and being able to engage in this issue, because the clients that come to us from the BMA community are experiencing racism, if racism is not what has brought them into the consulting room. There are aspects of the external world that's affecting them. So for us not to, for the white majority not to be able to engage in it is quite problematic. And I am very concerned that the fact that, you know, there is a higher proportion of people within the BMA community that, you know, the mortality rate is quite high, and they are, you know, there's a lot of them within the mental health institutions. So I'm just sort of quite desperate, and, you know, at times it's quite easy to, I echo what Peter said, because to some extent, you know, you're kind of thinking, you know, how are we going to get this to change? Is it in here? Is it out there? And it just all feels very overwhelming. But maybe we can take bits at a time and say, you know, if everyone tries to do what they can, then that is the beginning of change. So, you know, not to lose the faith or not to lose the hope, basically.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We've got 3 other people waiting. So next I've got people waiting. Got Joe, Philip again, and Nicholas Freeland. So Joe first. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. So I guess I wrote what we came up with in the group section, the chat, so I don't want to repeat that, but I think it touched upon something that Gita was just talking about, you know, in terms of the realities of service provision, not just in terms of what services we're providing as organizations, you know, and that's going to depend on each organization to look at and think about, but also how what we do relates to wider social service provision in mental health. You know, what are we engaging and taking responsibility for what's going on in the NHS? And we were talking in our group about, you know, not just the social individual aspect of psychosocial reality, but the political aspect of those, you know, kind of when you're looking at that, you know, to be anti-racist overtly and in an active sense came through both the talks that we heard. And actually there is a reality, a racist reality of service provision. And are we engaging with that on a political level? Do we have an overt value base as a profession that is engaging with structures as they exist in the world around us? Politically, do we have a voice? And I don't think we do at the moment. I think, you know, I understand the need for, you know, therapeutic neutrality, but I think there's a real fine line to be sort of walked there that we're not getting right. And I suppose we were asked to be courageous in the talks. And one of the things is that, you know, is it slightly easier? And it's a good thing if it is, in some ways, if it's allowed us to do it, to be focusing on this in the context of Black Lives Matters. But actually, as an organization and as a, you know, a psychotherapy kind of community, these realities, you know, Frank Lowe quoted John Steiner, realities out there to be looked for and to be kind of thought about. and to be deciding how we can be courageous more overtly as organisations.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so we've got Philip and Nicholas waiting. So Philip, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. Something that Gita was saying made me think about the position, say, of the British Psychotherapy Foundation, BPC, both, is to do with how do we reach out to the communities that we're talking about, professional and the public communities, reaching out, but also how we must be prepared to be reached by them, to be really reached by them, to have to change our way of thinking, feeling, and the kind of theories and models that we cling to in order to get through what can be a very difficult work project. But so I just wanted to say that about reaching out and being reached.
Thanks. Okay, Nicholas, you're next, and I can see Anthony's waiting after you. So just unmute yourself, Nicholas.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the point in the chat about that we can all be racist, and it's slightly problematic that I'm doing this. I don't know what the argument is behind that statement, but it just reading it made me think about that idea and the idea that racism goes both ways, which I don't know if that's what is intended or not, but maybe these thoughts kind of point to the limitations of the term racism. And I think I tend to not use it so much and use terms like white supremacism. And I think that what I'm trying to think about when I do that is that it involves a kind of wearing away of well-being for all of us and our humanity, but also that it kind of it involves a process of wearing away of meaning. And I think that racism, in some respects and in some people's hands, the meaning of it has kind of been worn away in some respects. And I think what excited me about this event and about Helen's work is that she talks about whiteness. And I think that with racism, it can become so disputed and so that you end up in such kind of confusing debates about what qualifies as racist. If you name it, you can get accused of committing it. Whereas I think whiteness cuts through in some ways, and white supremacism also does. And I think whiteness is something that we all identify with in ways and to degrees, and that our livelihoods often depend upon our identification with whiteness and our adjustment to the power of whiteness. So I think thinking about whiteness, talking about anti-blackness and anti-black violence or violences, I think is important. Also the violence of whiteness. And I think that when these sorts of things can't be said and can't be faced, and we're instead using at times terms like racism and certainly terms like diversity and difference and inclusion and the kind of managerial creep into this struggle for justice, that kind of rings alarm bells for me, that this probably isn't going to be serious or bring about the sort of serious change that I think Frank was referring to as needed. Sorry for the delay. I also had one thought was about that idea of helping, and a question about, if what draws people to this cause is to help people, that may also point to limitations, because I think that people who identify as white need to help themselves and heal themselves from the way in which they identify with whiteness and uphold its power and violence.
Okay, thanks, Nicholas. We've got 3 more people waiting. Anthony next, then after that, Ali and Paul. So, Anthony, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this morning. It's really been interesting. And I suppose from what Nick was just saying about the use of language, makes me really think about culture. And I think everybody sort of said it in different ways this morning about changing a culture and how big that is, that sort of task is. And it made me think of all the different sort of things that are mentioned today, like self-reflection, what happens in the room with your patient, what happens on trainings. But I think something hopeful is sort of happening this morning. And I think more about what we can do with each other as opposed to sort of intellectually reflecting on what's going on, which is important as well. But it made me think of what Philip Hewitt said about his comment about Freud and Jung and about the training institutes and his experience with Lennox. And it really made me think about how today I've had a conversation with people from different institutes, which I have never really done before. And that actually we are, in some ways, a psychotherapy community or a psychological community. And it made me think about how the different training institutes do act in some ways as colonizers, that, you know, they invite us in to think in certain ways. And this morning we're sort of doing a bit of decolonizing activity. And the idea that sort of good leaders, I think, are willing to learn, which makes me a bit nervous about this idea of training trainers, because we have so much within each other to use. You know, one of my sort of feelings is that it's very difficult to change the mind of people who aren't here, sort of like Paul Casman was saying. But actually, why not use each other more across institutions and show people that we're doing this and show people that we're trying to think about this as one of many, many ways of trying to change the culture. You know, it really struck me in the break. I could hear Frank Lowe talking to people. People were asking him about thinking space. And my experience is that Frank is the person who's known to talk about race. And that's a culture. And actually, we can change that a bit. So I suppose my sort of plea is finding ways where we use each other more and really use each other's bodies and positions and differences to show other people that it can be done, amongst all the other things.
Okay, thanks. I've just become aware of my position of muting and unmuting people and my sort of white authority here. It's quite uncomfortable, actually. And it's also making me think about something Frank said to us when we were talking during the breakout group in our group, that what does it mean for white people to give up power? I think I'll just say. Okay, we've got Ali and Paul after that, and then Helen's after that. Okay, so Ali, do you want to speak?
Yeah, this was really in response to Nicholas had pointed out what I'd written in terms of saying that we can all be racist, and I believe that's true, because I feel that I'm not negating anything. I agree very much with what Nicholas is saying, but I am also aware that the movement has led to this kind of black versus white, you know, and I'm seeing it as sort of white bashing from my point of view, when, you know, we all hold something unconsciously within us, and I certainly think the movement has allowed me to look inside myself again, all these sort of powerful, uncomfortable prejudices So I think in some ways I find it quite difficult to when I hear, you know, sort of black, white, where does the, sort of the other ethnicities sit within all this? And I guess I'm starting to hear it more as, you know, me and the other, and whatever race you are, there's going to be another, and having to work or come to terms with that. Yeah, for me, I think that helps much more to think in terms of that. This is aside, of course, from all the actual issues, I think, in a way.
Thanks. I can see we've got Paul and then Helen, and I'm aware of the time, and that might be it, I think. Is that right, Juliet? Would you go with that? Yeah, okay. So, Paul, if you want to speak. You need to unmute yourself, Paul.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I raised my hand before Anthony spoke, and Anthony probably expressed what I wanted to say, probably better than I could. But I think it was really keeping in mind the title of the event, Decolonizing Therapy, and I think the implicit power relations that are held within that. So in terms of actually how does therapy colonize the existence and the lived experiences of BME communities and BME individuals by marginalizing or having a problem with their experiences of race and racism, and also kind of recognizing lots of reenactments that take place. So if we're imposing dominant narratives and values from one group of people onto another people, what are we taking away from them? So are we allowing people of color or non-European or non-white people to be experts in their own experiences if their lived experiences actually challenge some of the dominant narratives and themes of therapy as they stand? So there still seems to be a little bit of sense of Black people having to ask permission to fully articulate their experiences, or find spaces like this in which it's safe to fully articulate their experiences, and really for people to understand that a lot of Black people have to develop the skill of actually strategizing how to tell your truth, as well as understanding your truth. You know, there's an equally important skill in actually negotiating past the defenses and the avoidances of the white center. So that was just some thoughts, really.
Thanks. Helen, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, all right. I just want to what Anthony said, because I'm very aware we're coming to the end, and it's something about the people. I agree that lots of people aren't here and lots of people wouldn't be here.
Helen, can you move a bit closer to your microphone?
Sorry. Yes, I'm very aware that what Paul said about the people who aren't here and the difficulty of the task, but I think what Anthony said was really important about this idea of the community of the willing and the interested. And it made me think about, do we need to, in the last few minutes, find a way for those people who want to continue with this in some form or another, can register that. You know, I'm happy to give my email address, or whether people write to the BPF or something, I don't know, but it would be, it just feels like there's been a really interesting discussion. You know, it would be, there are people who are wanting to carry on with that in some sort of connected way. I have no idea what, but I hope we can do something.
Yes, I mean, we will save the chat from this meeting. So if people, one way to do that is if people are interested in taking something forward in some shape or form, is to add your email address to the chat before the end of the meeting, or to contact the BPF, I guess.
Okay. Oh, you've got 3 minutes left. I think Helen's point is very important. I think this issue about always preaching to the converted that Paul mentioned is a real problem, which we're all trying to engage with. I suggest that people who would like to find some way forward from this meeting, who want to be involved in something else, I don't know quite what at this stage, but just if you'd like to be engaged in a further discussion, should write to email either Helen or indeed me and Jane. My name's Juliet Newbigin, and my email address is online, I think, and the BPC website. Joanna Lee, Paul Relader, and myself, and indeed Tim Fox, who's not here, are all members of the Scientific and External Events Committee at the BAP, the BPF, whoops, old-fashioned. And we put this event together rather quickly. And Anne Scott, I should mention, who I think is also here. So we would really like to think about this together in our committee, and we invite you, please, to get in touch with us if you want to take it further. So thank you all so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure you would like to thank also Helen, Frank, and Jane, who we are enormously indebted to for all the work that they've put in today. So, and to you, thank you, because you've worked hard too.